everybody. Welcome back to the Everyday Night. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jeff.
And tonight's episode is about free speech.
In particular, we're going to talk about the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
And what the meaning of free speech is and the limitations and so on, because that's an important issue these days.
And for us, we're also going to discuss how the virtues impact your exercise of free speech, or one's exercise of free speech.
Exactly.
All right. So before we do that, however, I think we should fortify ourselves.
Yes, I think we should.
So, and how are you fortifying? What's your fortification?
My fortification, I have a glass of a 2018 Amarone della Valpolicella. It's a dry red wine from the Veneto region of Italy. It's pretty bold, dry, went very nicely with the pizza I made this evening. Oh. And I'm continuing to enjoy a glass.
It's got a very deep color.
It does. It's a very
yeah.
Yeah. And what, pray tell, are you fortifying yourself with? I
am getting down to the last bits of the smoked maple bourbon. So it's rainy and cold. Been rainy and cold all day, so a warming liquor has been on my mind this evening. So
makes sense. So now that we're fortified,
yes. Well, I'm gonna have a drink. So
okay, sounds good. So people toss around freedom of speech. I have freedom of speech. It's my right to say what I want. And they're generally referencing or referring to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Yes.
And we happen to have the text of the
First
Amendment here.
This is easy to find. If anybody can type in First Amendment U.S. Constitution and get the exact text. And the exact text of it is, Congress shall make no law. And this is the important part. Congress shall make no law.
Yep.
Respecting an establishment of religion. That comes before the abridging of freedom of speech, right? So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Yep.
That's it.
And so essentially, you can say things, you can print things, the government can't censor what you're saying, can't restrict what you're saying. However, there are slander and libel laws, meaning that there can be consequences to speech. The old saying is you have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. I should mention falsely yell fire in a crowded theater. If there's an actual fire in a theater, you should let people know.
Right. But, well, you have abused your free speech and endangered people with it. That's an important point, I think, as we go on with what we're going to talk about. You told a lie and you put people in danger with it.
Yes. And that brings us right back to the virtues. And one of the first virtues, veritas, truthfulness, honesty. Free speech, you can say, it means you can say what you want without the government censoring you or limiting what you say, but there are consequences. the consequences, not necessarily from the government, but the consequences of what you say, just as your actions have consequences. And if you generally violating the virtues has some sort of consequence. They may be legal consequences or interpersonal consequences, but the government shall make no law. So the government's not saying you can't publish things. And this actually, there was a free speech movement that started in the University of California, Berkeley campus in the middle of the 60s, where students were protesting because the university, which was a state university, was limiting their discussion of political issues on campus and their right to talk about it. And they eventually won, but the governor was Ronald Reagan. And the University of California system was such low cost as to be nearly free to attend, until Reagan said, why should I pay for students to go to college just so they can protest me? And he eliminated the free cost of higher education in California.
He changed the public funding laws.
Exactly.
I mean, not all on his own. He couldn't do that, but he spearheaded it and got it through state Senate.
He did. And well, he also changed who the president of the university system and campuses, and he basically fiddled with a lot of things to get his way. So, but that was the free speech movement. It's an issue again on not just in the public arena, but on college campuses. When someone is invited to speak that students disagree with and they protest, can they do that? Well, yeah, they can protest, but the university can still invite who they want to speak there. And so one of the questions about free speech is not just about yelling fire, but about making threatening speech.
Yes.
And there are limits on threatening speech and on harassment and on other things. So the First Amendment was really about restraining the government from limiting people's ability to talk about political ideas, social ideas, but the government can still and has passed laws against libel and slander and hate speech and endangering people, and threatening people. Those are still illegal to do because those are not talking about ideas. This was the First Amendment was to protect the exchange of ideas, which really universities are supposed to be about as well. Respecting the exchange of ideas, a forum for the exchange of ideas.
Right. The idea that the prohibiting the free exercise, Congress will not prohibit the free exercise of of religion or free speech, right? So but this is the thing that we're up against now. The government isn't, through the First Amendment, the government is not allowed to say that your opinion is illegal. You cannot express your opinion. However, there's a difference between an opinion and a fact and a lie.
Yes. And the nefarious techniques of people who use free speech to promote hate are to say, hey,
or fear, just simple.
I'm just asking questions.
Right.
I'm just asking questions. I'm not saying this. I'm just asking the question. Or I'm just saying, well, what if? Or I'm, you know, the advocates, the people who are saying, well, what about replacement theory or this replacement, which is bullshit, the bullshit idea that there's a conspiracy by Jews to bring in non-white people into the United States to replace white people to create a more favorable electorate so they can enact their policies and end up controlling the country.
And I wonder what horrible policies the Jews could come up with that are worse than what we already have. It's like, then government would be corrupt. Is that the worry?
Or for the few rather than for the people.
Yeah, well, that's
but it's
how's that different?
It's nonsense. But the when you have a TV channel that calls itself a news channel, but has admitted in court that it's an entertainment program called a news channel, and I'm talking about Fox News, which is not news, it's propaganda, and they label it as entertainment, and they use all of these techniques to get away with it. And we've both known people who know the rules well enough to be right on the edge of, without crossing over into breaking the rules, but their behavior is bad.
Yes. And we also know people who have made careers out of finding, I should say, finding the hole in the fence, that there isn't any law, there's no rule restricting this, so I'm going to do this. It hasn't occurred to anybody to do this before, so I'm going to do it until there's a rule that says I can't.
Yes.
You know, there's a sort of a common understanding, but say, the rules don't say anything. The rules don't say I can't do that.
The rules don't say I can jump out of a tree on top of somebody. Well, now they do because of you.
Right.
You know, not you, but
I know. Well, I in my advice to SCA royalty, one of the, I think, most quotable things I've written is, don't make your successors write laws about you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and at one point, since you mentioned the SCA, I went through and completely went through with my officers, my curia, and did a rewrite, top to bottom. Let's go through the laws. And it took a while to do, but there were things that, there were people who were knew enough that they'd say, why is this in here? And so people who were experienced enough to say, well, this law is because of this person. So, well, that doesn't make sense. So I agree. It's called a law of attainder, which is forbidden in US legislation because it's a law aimed at a specific person. And there were plenty of examples like that. So,
well, aimed at a specific person or a specific circumstance.
Yes. But violating honesty, there are people who make a career of that.
Yes.
And but it's still, people can bullshit without fear of the government censoring them. But there still could be consequences from the people that they are bullshitting.
Right.
And should be.
And there should be. And that, well, and they're, as we pointed out, their consequences can be brought to bear within the law if malice is demonstrated or an untruth has, I think it's a kind of an and or situation where it has to be untrue and it has to have been spoken with or published with malice. That you were, the object was to harm the person.
Well, for example, there are politicians who are making a career out of supporting what is commonly known as the big lie. The big lie is that the 2020 presidential election was stolen.
Yes.
Rather than being one of the most closely monitored, fairest elections that there's been. But there are people who say this, and there are no consequences to them of saying that, of making that statement, of lying. That's why it's called the big lie, of making that, of lying. There are no government consequences to that.
There are lawsuits being brought against those people, the same way Alex Jones being sued over and over again for his lies about Sandy Hook.
Yes, and he lost. He lost in court
repeatedly. Oh, he's not done. He is not done defending himself against lawsuits. He's lost every single time. He's lost by default in a couple of them because he simply didn't provide any defense.
Well, yeah, because he horrible murders of children. He called a false flag, meaning that
hoax. He called it a hoax.
Yeah, meaning
it didn't actually happen.
Yes, and there are people. There was a couple more shootings, and the same type of people are referring to those as hoaxes. And they're not, and I hope they get their pantsuit off because the harm it inflicts for saying that no, this didn't really happen, and you who have lost loved ones, you're lying about it.
Right.
Your loved ones didn't exist, they weren't harmed. That's really harmful.
That's where the slander comes in. You're calling me a liar. You're lying, but you're calling me a liar. That is where I get you.
And that rhetorical technique is absolutely nefarious, to turn around to claim, to assert that what you're doing is actually what the other person's doing. And we see that.
I'm saying that a plaintiff in a suit like that is saying that by telling this lie, you are calling me a liar.
Yes.
So that is the slander that the person is being sued for. You're saying that I misrepresented something, for some gain.
So violations of honesty can also be, it's too mild to call it discourtesy.
Yes.
That doesn't because it's so far beyond merely being discourteous that as to be hateful. That which is hateful to you, do not do to another person. Every religion has a statement like that. And the First Amendment also talks about Congress making no law establishing a religion. And yet we see in many locations currently, and even up to very likely including the Supreme Court, laws being made that are promoting and establishing the views of a single religion on all the people of the state or the country.
Or at least basing their argument on a religious belief.
Yes. In some cases, was it like 15th, 14th century belief statement?
Yeah,
in the leaked statement from Justice Alito, where he cited a legal scholar of the Middle Ages.
Yes, from the 16th century.
Yes. It's so far beyond absurd. It is crossing into evil to do that, because it's not just that it's violating the First Amendment, but it's causing harm to people and denying that it causes harm to people. And it's a question we haven't really talked about much, but we've alluded to. What is evil? And I think that one definition is the lack of empathy. The actions that result from a lack of empathy can often be defined as evil.
Yes. It's when it's evil when it is both self-serving. To me, there's it's self-serving, and as you say, requires a complete lack of empathy to enact,
and causes harm thereby. So the nature of communication has significantly changed. The vehicles of communication have changed since the First Amendment was written, since the late 18th century.
You mean from posting a bill in the public square?
Yeah, exactly.
Or having a town crier?
Well, and a press. I mean, they had presses.
Well, that's what but I'm saying, but lots of people couldn't read.
Yeah.
So, you would post a bill, you'd post something in the square or on the church door or whatever, and then you would have someone who could read it to the public who couldn't necessarily.
Right. So now,
and then in the United States, we established public education.
Yes, which
that every single citizen could take advantage of, so that they could read the laws for themselves and be educated about their own government.
Yep. And there are people who are opposed to public education. There are people who are opposed to the existence of every public institution that there is.
Yep. And they're all the same. They're the same people.
They are the same people. And they seem to read the Constitution less and read Atlas Shrugged more. The question, and I don't think either of us has an answer for this. The question is what to do about people who are using the First Amendment to spout lies, hate, nonsense, manipulation, propaganda, bullshit.
Well, as we mentioned before we began, we used to have this thing called the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah.
That the Federal Communications Commission, isn't that what?
The FCC, the 4 commissioners of the FCC in 1987 did away with the Fairness Doctrine. Fairness Doctrine said that there had to be equal time given. It's not the same as the equal time doctrine, but it essentially means that different broadcasting was in the public interest, and therefore different points of view had to be given,
right.
had to all be represented. The commissioners ostensibly were 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. However, 3 of them were appointed by Reagan and 1 was appointed by Nixon.
Right.
And they voted to do away with the Fairness Doctrine. And it's been a problem because it had allowed single viewpoint broadcasters. I mean, they're obviously not just broadcasting, but
Right.
cable and online and so on, but for just as a general term, broadcasters, single point of view broadcasters, to be able to say what they wanted to say without having to represent other points of view.
Right. Well, and it essentially allowed them to cherry pick facts to represent
alternative facts.
Yeah,
Truthiness.
well, that's a more modern thing, but I'm saying that, only quote studies that bore out their point of view, or only.
Well, and they aren't even quoting studies. They're I'm not in a what I would call a legitimate way.
No, well, I'm talking about back in the 80s and 90s, before things were completely out of hand, when there was still a certain amount of integrity in the larger media corporations.
Well, at one point there was an absolute firewall between the news operations of television, radio, and newspapers, and
their advertisers.
The advertising function. Yeah. The people who sold advertising were not allowed in the newsroom. Right. Were not allowed to speak to journalists. Were not allowed. They simply weren't. But news programs, television news programs, were not considered a profit center.
Right.
They were in the public interest, as the FCC required. Once that changed and news operations became a profit center, and then they took down the wall between news and advertising, and then you see favorable stories in the news about their advertisers.
Right.
And a lack of critical coverage of their advertisers.
Right. And critical advertising of their competitors and so on. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we don't, like you say, we don't have a complete answer to this, or how that could be reinstated without some major change in how government is run. The political appointments, I think, are becoming the downfall of government. The way, I mean, look at the Supreme Court is just the most glaring example.
And my solution to the Supreme Court is that, I mean, there are a lot have been proposed. One of the number of justices on the Supreme Court has changed many times. It has generally matched the number of courts right below it.
Right.
It doesn't match the number of courts right below it now. The number of courts right below the Supreme Court are 13. There should be 13 Supreme Court justices, and particularly because a couple of them, the appointments, were done nefariously through the machinations of the leadership of the Senate.
And that's demonstrable. That hypocrisy, you simply can't ignore that. That's, no one can call that anything but absolute hypocrisy on the part of Senate leadership at the time.
People, you can't shame someone for their hypocrisy if they have no shame.
No, but I'm not talking about saying someone who wanted to make a change can point to it. It's not about shaming that person and making them admit they did something wrong. It's about saying, look how this rule was taken advantage of.
Yes.
This cannot be allowed to continue.
And so that's one solution. Another solution, and it works with that I've heard of, is that Supreme Court appointments, this would require a constitutional amendment, would be for 20 years.
No, yeah, term limit.
And so they would, and the terms would be staggered so that every president would get to appoint a couple, and the next. So it would constantly be moving. So you wouldn't be stuck with people on the Supreme Court for 40, 50 years.
Yeah, and a third of which had been appointed by someone who never actually won a popular vote, never actually had more than 50%.
Exactly.
Favorable polling. I mean,
right.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing. I've not heard that before.
So there are solutions. The problem is getting the people who can enact them to enact them. One interesting study I saw, it was a study of when nonviolent protests have caused a regime change in a country.
Okay.
And it was compared it to violent protests, which never lead to a regime change. But nonviolent protests lead to regime change if a certain percentage of the country, of the people,
yes,
take to the streets. And I don't remember the exact percentage, but it worked out to be something like, in the United States, it would be like 13 million people take to the street. I thought
it was like 4%.
Something, I don't remember the exact number. I'd have to look that up. But it takes time too. And when you look at and that's freedom to peace, the right of the people peaceably to assemble.
Yeah.
Peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. And that, in the First Amendment, when that is done, that can lead to the government finally taking action on things. And there have been examples of that. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movements.
I think that we used to have things like national referendums that were not simply votes for representatives, but they have them locally still.
Yeah.
And I don't know when the last one was, but there were national referendums where a polling that is on the ballot, the official ballot, that says, should the government do this, or should the government refrain from whatever? Wording of the referendum has to be very carefully crafted to get an honest result.
Yes.
But
and that's there's some thought that Brexit in the UK was it passed because of the way it was worded.
Oh.
And people didn't understand they were voting to do it rather than to stay. And they also, the timing of when they did it, there were a lot of people on holiday, apparently.
Oh.
So it was, those questions, referenda questions, are very hard to write well, particularly given the reading level of a lot of people. So Mike Tyson was on a plane and a passenger on the plane was harassing him. Mike Tyson, former heavyweight boxing champion, a passenger was harassing him and throwing things at him, including a water bottle.
Now, I don't know. I'm just that kind of guy who's curious. Was it a full water bottle or was it an empty water bottle? Because it makes a difference.
It does make a difference.
but go on.
It makes a difference. But does it really? Would you throw even an empty water bottle at Mike Tyson?
I wouldn't throw an empty water bottle at anybody.
Okay.
To get some sort of in order to provoke them. I wouldn't do that at all.
Right. And Mike Tyson turned around and punched the guy.
Yep.
And neither of them want to press charges against the other one. So the authorities weren't pressing charges. So it was being dropped. But it reminded me of something you said many years ago about a particular person who was saying things online that you said, if he said them to somebody's face in a bar, he should expect to get punched.
Well, he was saying things publicly, but the things that would have got him punched, he sent to me directly. They were not insults about me, which I could have laughed off, but they were horrible things said about my lady at the time.
Yes. And he was saying horrible things publicly too.
Yeah. To lots of people.
Yes. And called me names, and he was saying things that were, I was all for ignoring him and counseled that until I couldn't, because he quoted me as saying something, but interpreted it to mean exactly the opposite of what I meant by what I said. Real manipulation. So I had to respond. I say, I said this, but in the context, here's what it meant. And by the way, shame on you.
Right.
For doing what you're doing. And that's when he came back and called me names and insulted me and stuff, which I don't really care about. Except he was somebody who had sworn an oath to do the right and the good and say the truth and be courteous and all of those things. And he was doing none of those. In fact, he was doing the opposite of those. And you and I have both, upon occasion, entered establishments known primarily for the serving of spirituous liquors.
We have.
Yes.
And there's a joke in there somewhere. You still owe me a night walks into a bar joke, but
okay. Well, in that case, it would have been 2 nights walk into a bar.
2 nights walk into a bar. 2 dukes walk into a bar.
2 dukes walk in.
That's a different joke.
Work on that one. 2 dukes walk into a bar.
A Western Duke and a no, never mind.
Anyway,
get off in the weeds there. SCA weeds.
Yes. But some of those places, there's a certain propriety, another virtue, certain propriety expected, that you behave appropriately for the venue and the situation. And
well, this is just what you're talking about here is just in public.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have to be a purveyor of liquors. It could be a Denny's. It could be
an ice cream shop.
An ice cream. Yes.
And yes. I know I've certainly seen people behaving badly in all sorts of public venues, elbowing people out of the way to get to the front, not being patient, not being respectful of other people's, certainly not being respectful of personal space, especially during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And and yet again, we have people saying it's a hoax. It's not real. And
1 million people say it's real.
Yes, and their family. Well, although some of those people on their deathbeds, dying from COVID-19, swore that it was a hoax. And well,
then to quote Ebenezer Scrooge, better they be quick about it and decrease the surplus population.
Oh, dear. I'm not sure he's the example you want to quote, but I do at times struggle with my own tendency to enjoy Schadenfreude a little too much.
Is enjoying Schadenfreude redundant?
Well, you can enjoy your own experience of joy.
Oh, all right.
And so
fair enough. Okay.
Okay. So I'm saying I'm experiencing Schadenfreude, but I'm feeling a little guilty about it.
Oh,
because, right?
Yeah.
And
sure.
so I recall something that I think it was Mark Twain wrote. I've never killed a man, but I've read some obituaries with great pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, then that's the thing. It's like, I wouldn't wish harm on anyone that didn't bring it upon themselves, that was on an innocent.
Well, but isn't both the kindest thing and the cruelest thing you could say to somebody, may you get what you deserve?
Yeah. Yes, and certainly.
So, but yeah, the problem is when people behave badly, it affects other people. It often affects other people.
Yes, often.
There are some what are referred to as victimless crimes, which essentially are based on morality, usually moral laws in the public sphere, which is another issue that we could talk about, certainly with regard to the establishment of religion. For example, laws that prohibit people from buying alcohol on a Sunday until a certain time or at all.
Right.
Because we lived, was it Pennsylvania?
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't sell any alcohol on Sunday at all. And they have state stores too, but that's another thing. But those are known as blue laws, and those are religious. When I was an undergraduate, the town I went to college in was a dry town.
Yeah.
Until a Holiday Inn approached the city and said, we want to build a hotel in your city. And they said, well, that's great, but you can't have a bar. We said, if we can't have a bar, we're not building a hotel. And all of a sudden, the laws changed. Yep. And they could put a bar. So the other hotel in town wanted a bar. And so then restaurants said, well, if they have bars, we want to be able to serve. Sure. And so there you go.
You can't make the law, can't make them exceptions to the law.
Right.
No, well, and there again, we have the demonstrated hypocrisy of many religious beliefs. Right. And we talked about this before. Yeah, there are moral laws that are more. I mean, you can say that well, murder is killing somebody is a moral law, is a law. Killing someone's immoral. Yeah, it is, because there's a victim.
Right.
Buying alcohol on Sunday, there's no victim.
Right.
As you say.
The question of laws or morality, as some people contend, well, morality has to come from religion. Well, no, that's not true. And we've talked about this before. Yeah. People have evolved to be social animals, social people.
Yeah.
And for society to function, there's a certain social contract, certain rules, and people have evolved to be collaborative and cooperative and respectful and other things. And it's the people who aren't who are the aberrations.
Yes. And for all this country talks about the rugged individualist, all you rugged individualists out there, go please far away into some remote area and be rugged, as rugged as you like.
May the Lord bless and keep the czar far away from us. Yes.
Yeah. And that's kind of, you can't call yourself a rebel. That the whole idea of saying, oh, I'm a rebel, and the whole Confederate flag thing, I think stems from, well, I shouldn't say the whole thing. When the Confederate flag came under the scrutiny that it has come in the last,
the Confederate,
so,
the battle
flag of Virginia,
yeah,
in particular, it for, I think for many, it was considered a sign of rebellion against authority and the establishment, and that was the extent of it. But it became a racist symbol.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, it was a racist symbol. I think it lost that for many people, but then it started being adopted by overtly racist organizations again.
It was specifically brought back by racist organizations, yes, to use as a symbol.
Right. And so therefore you lose the validity of the argument that no, it just means rebellion. No, not anymore.
And not in anymore. Places, in countries that have outlawed the use of the swastika, those groups use the Confederate battle flag.
Right. Or they've invented and adopted
other symbols. Yep.
Right. So, and
people are free from government restraint on certain kinds of speech, but hate speech, and I've had to explain this to, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I've had to explain to people that a hate crime is not a thought crime. It's not
right.
a punishment in addition to the crime because of how somebody thinks. It's based on action, because hate crimes are terrorism. They are not an expression of how somebody thinks. They are an attempt to intimidate an entire group of people through certain actions.
Right.
And
it's terrorism.
And that's terrorism. Hey, it's unfortunate that they were called hate crimes. They should have been called terrorism, because that's really what they are.
We looked at President Biden's speech in Buffalo, or I don't know if he was in Buffalo or it was just I know he was in Buffalo after the shooting.
Went there.
Talked to some of the families, and I think is the first president. Well, I don't remember if Obama actually used the phrase domestic terrorism. I remember for a long time there was a why don't you call it what it is, domestic terrorism, in the Obama administration. But Biden actually came right out and said that white supremacy is domestic terror. And I don't know that any other president has had the courage to do that before now.
I don't know if any have.
But it points out how bad it has gotten.
Yes. Yes.
So, and that is the problem we're talking about here, and why we're talking about what free speech is and what the government can do is a direct result of this kind of white supremacist, ultra conservative, right-wing fascist movement.
And those all used to be different things. And they're not.
They're not any, well, it's a matter of degree, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're all on a spectrum.
A very white spectrum.
Very white.
That goes from white to very white.
Yeah, goes from white to blind.
Yeah. And so that we are left with a challenge, all of us.
A conundrum.
A conundrum. Because people can say these things without being censored from doing that by the government, but their speech has to have consequences. Hate speech and hateful actions have to have consequences, because if they don't, they lead to the kinds of things we've seen, and the laws, hateful laws, and also hateful actions by individuals who are easily manipulated by the purveyors of hate speech.
And we've talked about so many of these things in so many different, under so many different subjects, how a lot of this stuff is tied together. The de-education of our population,
Yeah.
the removal of guardrails on public speech, and the ideas that the blatant manipulation of the First Amendment, like we're talking about, to weaponize it, to
and
manipulate.
The defunding of public education has been a big one, because people don't recognize logical fallacies when they're being used. They don't recognize rhetorical techniques when they're being used to manipulate.
Well,
because
it's not like we were taught that in high school. I mean, there are some schools, I guess, who still have debate teams, but I haven't heard of one. There's no funding for that kind of stuff anymore. That's part of the problem.
We had debate, but we our writing curriculum was about learning how to construct logical and well-supported arguments. And if they weren't, you'd hear about it. And so in some ways it was embedded in everything, and everything we wrote about. We wrote about history. It was embedded in that you had to write logically and cite sources and credible sources, and what's a credible source. And I have to explain to students now the difference between a credible source and a not credible source.
Yeah.
I have to do that all the time. And part of that is, well, if it's on the internet and I can find it,
it's a source.
It's a source.
That's all. It's just a source.
Yeah, but not everything on the internet is true.
What do you say?
Shocking, I know.
Yeah, geez. My whole life, my whole world has turned topsy-turvy. Yeah. Well, yeah. So these things are all tied together, and we are seeing them in a culmination now. And what's worrying to me is this is such a trite term now, the echo chambers that are being built and maintained and fortified, and that, I think, is the real problem.
Yeah.
And you've got two sides of an argument, both sides claiming that the other side doesn't see the truth. And I don't know how, but I think that there has to be a way for us to establish what is an objective truth.
Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Daniel Patrick Moynihan said that. decades ago.
Yes.
And still people are, I referred to the term earlier, alternative facts. In the very first episode of his old show, The Colbert Report, Stephen Colbert coined the term truthiness.
Yeah.
It's not, it feels like it's true, so it must be, and it's truthiness. And that's good enough. Because he was
all he means by that is that it seems true because it bolsters my pre-existing belief.
Yes. There's cognitive bias and selective reinforcement of pre-existing opinions. I know we both value talking with people who have different points of view.
Yeah.
But I will not play pigeon chess. Pigeon chess is when the term refers to the futility of sitting down to play chess with a pigeon.
Right.
Because while you're trying to make moves, the pigeon will knock all the pieces off the board and crap on the board. And that's pigeon chess. So for me to have a purposeful discussion with somebody that has any potential value, we have to agree on certain conditions. We have to agree to have a common basis of understanding in facts. We have to agree to focus on the facts, not on personalities, not on ad hominem attacks, not on logical fallacies. We have to agree on the facts and talk about that and ideas, discuss ideas.
Right.
If we cannot agree on those things, we have no basis for discussion.
But this, I think, is our essential problem, is that one side of pick a social argument that's going on right now. One side will say, these are the facts. These are the facts.
Show me the evidence.
Well, here's my evidence.
Except it's not credible evidence. It's not truthful evidence. It's not factual evidence.
But that's because you don't think it's credible. I think it's absolutely credible. I don't think your facts are credible because of the sources you've used. See, this is the argument.
Yeah, but criticizing the source is a fallacy. It can be a fallacy because unless the source has been repeatedly proven to not be using credible methods.
But see, this is one, let's call a spade here. The one side is conspiracy theory. We're getting into conspiracy theory now.
Right.
One side is claiming that anything that comes out that is counter to my bias is in on it.
Yes.
You know, this conspiracy goes so deep that you can't find, you have to look on the fringes for the truth because the deep state or the leftist college system or whatever is controlling all of this information and is so deeply embedded in the machine that the truth simply can't come out unless someone is a complete outlier. They have to be outside the system. They have to be disrespected by the system because the system itself is the problem.
Yeah.
This is the
and
argument.
That kind of self-fulfilling hamster wheel of bullshit.
Yeah.
The hamster wheel of bullshit. I like it. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's what it is. That maybe that's why it's a cue, because you can rotate it by the tail of the cue and it's a hamster wheel of bullshit. Now you're talking about deprogramming a cultist.
Yes. You're exactly right.
And that's really difficult. That is extremely difficult to do.
Indeed. En masse, it's even worse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So what do we do? How do we do it? How do we agree that there is one set of objective facts that neither side can ignore?
Well, let me know when you figure it out.
Well,
I
that was
think
a rhetorical question.
one of the things, going back to public education, funding of public education, was so that an educated public, which is necessary for a democracy,
yes,
is educated to the level where they can evaluate facts and data for themselves and look at it and say, this is credible, this is bullshit. And I was discussing something with someone online, and who I said, well, I disagree. And here, peer-reviewed study, peer-reviewed study, peer-reviewed study, conclusion. And here's what it says. And their response was, oh, you can't trust peer-reviewed studies. They're the worst. They're absolutely, you can't, it's all. And I said, we have no basis for discussion.
Right. But this is exactly what I was talking about.
Right.
Well, they're peers, right? They're all these ivory tower intellectuals that are considered peers. So you can't trust them because they're insular.
And look at hydroxychloroquine. Are you fucking kidding me?
Ivermectin. Let's go down the list.
And injecting bleach and
well,
I know but again, an example of a cult. We are living in the middle of a cult trying to take over the country. And if that sounds like hyperbole, too bad. It's a supportable thesis.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That we are in the middle of watching a cult takeover of the United States, and embedded by people who don't believe the bullshit, but are profiting from it.
Oh, well, yeah, and
that's evil.
That's evil. And that's a lot of evangelical Christians. That
the big churches,
the
mega churches with the whole prosperity gospel thing.
When somebody like Joel Osteen, and what I don't understand is how, I don't understand. I'm sure I would be fascinated to have some member of this congregation explain to me how Joel Osteen, Billy Graham, pick one of them, who owns
Graham. I didn't obviously agree with his message, but I can see some value in Billy Graham. His son, however, Franklin Graham, who has inherited Billy Graham's evangelical empire, he is a bullshit artist.
Well, he grew up in the family business, and I think that's how he sees it.
Yeah.
But the idea, and I want to hear one of these congregations, one of the members of these congregations, to justify your pastor owning a $50 million estate. Where do you think that money came from?
Yes.
Where and what can possibly justify their spending it like that on themselves? If they're asking you, it has to be on your donations. That is their source of income.
Do you remember the activist and comedian Dick Gregory?
Yeah,
he was
pretty young.
Activist, peace activist, civil rights activist, comedian. And I remember something he said once, that any person who purports to be preaching the word of God who has more than a single suit of clothes is a liar.
Interesting.
I thought, okay, that's maybe a little extreme, but I take his point.
Sure.
And honestly, he wasn't a preacher, but he was certainly an activist, and he lived, he walked the walk.
Yeah.
So,
well, I had a coworker once point out to me, it was a revelation, and I'd always been kind of like, I grew up with no religion in my home as a kid, but all of my friends, I had a Methodist friend a couple doors down, I had a Catholic friend across the street, I had a Jewish friend around the block. And I went to, I would stay at their houses overnight, and I would go to whatever their services were on Saturday or Sunday, or, whatever was appropriate. And so I got to listen to the sermons, and I got to see how their services were enacted and whatever. And I could compare and contrast as a kid. And mostly you're just sort of looking around at the architecture and the pretty windows and stuff like that. But it seeps in a little bit. But I was never told this is the one thing you have to believe, because this is what our family, this is what your grandparents believed. I was never fed any of that. But so I was never really, religion was a curiosity for me, and that was all. But a coworker of mine once said that religion, how do you present it? The religion basically lost its validity when the preacher turned around. And what he meant by that was that originally the priest, the druid, the priest, whoever was the representative of the congregation to the gods. His back was to the audience and to the congregation, he faced the altar and implored God on behalf of the congregation. When the priest turned around and became the authority of God to the congregation, that's when it lost its validity to him. That many thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, whatever, when that single phrase, when the priest turned around, and that's, to me, where is the litmus test, is the test. Is the priest representing you to God, or is the priest telling you what God wants from
you? Yeah, it depends. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I think a lot depends on whether or not the religion has that hierarchy that you have to go through to reach God. That's not true in Judaism, in that every individual goes directly to God. But there are, and one of the issues I have with rabbinical Judaism is the laws, the rules that have been piled on that interpret God's will to say certain things.
Right. And only certain people are allowed to do that interpretation. And, as you say, in
yeah, I was place I worked once, my boss said, well, do you celebrate, because it was coming up on the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. He said, do you observe those? Do you celebrate? I said, well, I do, after fashion, in my own way, according to my own judgment, as I best see fit. And he looked at me and said, that's sort of how you do everything, isn't it? I said,
well, yes.
Well, yes, it is. Because to put it in a religious context, the Lord endowed each of us with certain potentials and abilities and potentials.
Okay.
And therefore, I am obliged to use them. And among those are the ability to reason. And therefore, I must subject everything to an analysis, a reasonable analysis. because to not do so and merely accept something blindly is to dishonor the gifts that God has given me.
Yes. And
yes. that I've used that to actually confound some people before.
Well, it's certainly
you're questioning everything. I have to. I'm obliged to.
Yeah. If I am to believe in God, therefore these other things also must follow.
Right.
They would follow whether I believe in God or not.
Yeah.
But if your claim is that all of these gifts come from God, then this is how I have decided to use them.
Right.
So certainly,
I gave you 3 chances, right? The boat, the car, the boat, the helicopter. I gave you 3 chances.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Or
should I just number them now?
Yeah. Your jokes.
Yeah. Number 87. It's in the delivery.
It is. That's another old joke.
Yes.
Well, that's I've seen that comic, that cartoon with
yes.
About COVID, and he died from COVID. He thought God would protect him. God sent us scientists.
Yeah.
God sent us doctors when you didn't listen to any of them.
So I think we haven't offered any solution that's easy to achieve, because difficult problems do not have easy solutions except in science fiction and fantasy. I think education is certainly one, but that's another battle.
Yeah, it is.
Where the same people, the same nefarious people, are fighting the ability to educate people.
And we can talk about that as a whole thing, because I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have. Education, because I think that it is, as you pointed out, it is essential to our democracy. But there is and this is too much to get into right now, but the idea that, or this is one of my most recent beefs, is that parents know best for their children. Boy, I know too many people that I wouldn't trust with a spoon in public who are raising children. And
is it a sharp spoon?
It doesn't have to be sharp. If it were sharp, someone should definitely take it away from them. But they're allowed to have a spoon. I still think they're going to hurt themselves or someone else.
Yeah.
They are bringing up a generation of people just like them. And it frightens me and terrifies me.
Public education is supposed to combat the ignorance of people, and give people an opportunity,
right, to at least examine another viewpoint
and to improve themselves. I mean, there's a lot about the myths of the U.S. being an upwardly mobile society anymore, but if there is a vehicle for social mobility, it's education.
Yeah.
The part of the problem is the way public education is funded or not funded, based on property taxes in many places, means that the wealthy areas have better schools.
Well, and the other end of that little teeter-totter is that poorer schools, I mean, or poorer districts, not only have less funding, they have more, what's the word I want to use here? More fundamentalist thinking.
That's possible. Yeah. In some, particularly if you're talking about rural districts.
Right.
So,
And the idea that public religious schools, I was
yeah, well, diverting public funding to private schools, particularly private religious schools, is respecting an establishment of religion.
right.
It violates the First Amendment.
Yep.
If you want to send your children to a private school, that doesn't exempt you from supporting public schools. It's an additional burden you have to pay because you're choosing to do that. You want to support education. You want your children to have a good education. Support the public schools.
Right. And you should have to pay to indoctrinate your child.
Yourself. Yeah.
Yep. And that has been when Betsy DeVos proposed that was my trigger for storming Washington.
Yeah.
To me, that is where I would draw the line for violent insurrection.
Well, I think violent insurrection is not as effective as nonviolent.
True,
massive nonviolent
civil disobedience.
Well, sure.
Especially,
but you should be able to delay gratification for a higher good.
Because I'm a grown-up.
Yes. Ostensibly.
Well, by most objective definitions, anyway.
Yeah.
And that's
so anyway.
So anyway,
my glass is empty.
Oh yeah.
Before either of us launches into another rant,
another diatribe.
Yes.
Yes.
Is there a difference between a rant and a diatribe?
I don't know. Probably. I think a diatribe uses good grammar. I don't think. I think a rant can be less grammatically correct than a diatribe, because I think.
Show me your sources. Support your thesis.
I'm only positing. I am not asserting.
Okay, so you have posited a theory.
Yes.
Now the burden of proof is on the person making the assertion.
If I care to prove it, as I say, it is only I'm only positing a theory. I don't the conclusion or the verity of my theory has no worth to me. It's not
well,
worth
then it certainly doesn't matter to me.
There we are. We agree on something.
We agree on something. And with that, I think we have reached an end of this.
I think we've taken up enough of these good people's time.
So thank you. Please subscribe, follow, listen, suggest ideas, write to us.
Yeah, please.
And until next time, be thou
a good night
and true.